Well, with risk management, there is a life cycle to help us track, manage, and obviously identifying risks within our business and our organization, all the way through its life cycle, along with frameworks to help us do this. So let's cover some areas of the five, I guess the four areas around our risk management life cycle. And the very first one is risk identification, right? We want to go away and identify what that risk is. And that's typically number one, right? We need to know what exists because if we don't know what exists, well, then we can't manage it, we can't track it, we can't close it, and obviously go through our response and our monitoring as well. So that's our first one. So once we've identified what those risks are, then we can obviously go do our assessment. So step two is risk assessment. And this is where we can go do our types of assessments, so quantitative, qualitative, right? And we've discussed these in other videos. Um, these are things where we're going to go look for business critical functions or critical assets across the organization that typically fall into those categories, right? And then we put in controls that we have in place, right? So, do we have controls around certain functionality? Are they working? Do they help us address that risk? Or maybe they're residual risks or inherent risks or current risks that we have to define and prioritize and plan. So, from that comes out our plan, right? And then we'll typically have our priority list. And then in that priority list, it will tell us from maybe from 1 to 20, what our risks are and the priority assigned to them. So then once we have that priority, and then we know based on the likelihood and the impact to the organization, well, then we can consider that risk appetite. And we'll cover what risk appetite is in another video. Risk appetite essentially is the influences, what risks we're willing to accept and not accept in our cross our environment. So what do we do about them and how we respond and mitigate those types of risk. So that's risk assessment. And the following next one up as we continue up this ladder is our risk response. So now we've got our plan. We've obviously, okay, so let's start from the bottom. So we've identified the risks, we've done our risk assessment. So we've come out with our plan, we've done our qualitative or quantitative risks. We now have our criticality, likelihood and impacts of those risks. And now we're going to go in to respond to those risks. So we're going to have some sort of treatment plan. We're going to respond to that priority list and have that defined. And then we're going to typically go through ATMA. And are we going to choose to accept, transfer, mitigate, or avoid that risk? And obviously go through that in detail. And then one of those typically risks, one of those risks typically fall into one of those responses, or maybe two responses. What's best fitting for that organization, and obviously the goals and the objectives. And we've covered a couple of things and things to consider when we're responding to risks. So from that point on, we're going to be putting in those controls in place to mitigate those type of risks by obviously doing something about them, right? And then finally, as we continue up, well, then we've got to go away and monitor and report. And that's the important part. We've got to keep track and report those things. And typically we'll come out of that with some sort of, risk plan. That's going to be a current action plan. So typically from there, we're going to monitor the risk, monitor the controls to make sure that the controls are functioning and addressing the risk that we're circumventing and preventing. And obviously then going and monitoring our risk for any other changes that are happening. And then obviously finally report on that. So when we report, we want to be collaborative across the environment and complete that with collaborative nature with our executive team as well. So they're informed and then we can make intelligent decisions based on those specific outcomes. Now, they're the sort of the four areas around our risk management life cycle. So identifying the risk, assessing the risk, responding to that risk, and monitoring and finally reporting actively on those things with our certain stakeholders. The next part of that is our risk management itself. So what's that very first step? So I've got another sort of triangle down here, and I'm just going to sort of go through this together with you because there's different forms of risk management, and I sort of want to define exactly what they are. So risk management, well, the first step in any risk management process is to decide basically on a risk management framework. So I'm just going to put framework because there are many frameworks out there that can help us, and we have to pick what works within our organization. And basically, you kind of think of this as a toolbox to help us, right? It's a matrix to rate ourselves against or our business against, right? They have a benchmark and we define what that benchmark looks like, right? There's best practices in the industry and how to deal with risk. So we're going to have to be able to provide us, well, the frameworks themselves provide us with the tool sets to understand the risk, look into the risks in our environment, and identify that risk, which obviously help us to identify, to track, to document, and ultimately at the end of the day, deal with that risk. So the next question I have is, well, what sort of framework do we have? And I'll say framework again, because after we sort of define what framework is, well, then we're going to have to go away and determine, well, which framework do we pick? Do we pick one? Do we pick different ones? Well, what's available firstly? So we've got to go away and define what they are. And then depending on different factors, right? So could be risk appetite, so the amount of risk we're willing to accept within the business, or how much executive support do we have, or the business and the culture of the environment, so the organizational culture around security and risk management, and are they bought into that process? Do we need to spend time, working with them, workshopping, and then defining what they are? Other customers as well. Do we have customer considerations that we need to take into play, right? Do we have compliance? May they help us define and determine what they are based on new customers, or establish maybe continual businesses that we need to deal with? And this typically falls in under compliance, because most businesses will say, well, we need to see your compliance documentation. Are you ISO certified? Are you running NIST? And if you are, well, we want to see your ISO 27001 compliance, and that could open up new business opportunities, or maybe support existing opportunities, right? So they're going to have some sort of, framework there that's going to follow us. Now, the question that we have is, well, again, what frameworks exist? And there's a couple, and I'm going to put another one here because there's a few that I want to cover, right? And I'll start off with this tab. There's two here, and then I'll cover two more over there. The first two are obviously a very common one, which is the ISO 27001 path. Now we can go down that ISO path. Considerations with ISO, it can be quite costly. So we're going to have to make sure that we've got executive buy-in ultimately to help us drive this initiative. And then we're going to have to obviously pay for the documentation. Now we don't have to spend a lot of money on the documentation, but it does cost something for us having that information security management system, including that risk management process. So think of the ISO as more as a generalized information security for systems, and then that includes as well our risk management as well. So it includes information for this, information security for the environment, plus our risk management, which is a small component of that ISO 27001. Then there's the ISO, I think the ISO 27005 process, which is all about information security risk management. So it's much more comprehensive, deep dive into risk management. So ISO 27001 is usually the good place to start if we're beginning that process or that journey to identify our information security and risk management. And then, it's much more simpler. Once we have that simplified and defined, but then we can move into our ISO 27005 process, which again is more geared towards risk management. So I'm just going to put here risk management. So they're the two sort of frameworks that you can go down that path of. Then also there is the ISO. Now you can start to see the ISO is a big player in the field. So then we have our ISO 3110 process, and that includes our risk management and also dives into risk assessments. So it's super important for that risk management program, right? You can start to see that this process of risk assessments and how to do them adequately is across that ISO 31 and 10 process. If we don't want to go down that ISO route, there's obviously other paths. So if we don't want to go down 27001, 27005, or finally the triple whammy here with the 31 and 10, there's obviously things that we can utilize, which is NIST. So NIST, the National Institute of Technology, they've come out with obviously their own, programs to help us across information security and risk management. And a couple of these NIST ones are the special publication 800 TAC 37, which is a very common guide for applying risk management frameworks to federal information systems. So it's very common in the States and overseas across Department of Defense, the US government, etc. And it's quite widely recognized across the world. And that deals with, the NIST 800, I would just say here, the special publication 800 37, which is the main one there. And that is our risk management framework for the financial institutions or the federal information systems across the state. So it's quite recognized, it's favorable around risk management itself. Um, so which Well, if we talk about ISO as well, or ISO itself has a general information security plus risk management program, and so does NIST, right? So the again going through that ISO, the NIST 800 TAC 37, then NIST has its own risk management process as well. So there's the 800 39. I'm going to put 39. That's the NIST special publication, and the TAC 39 basically is everything to do with information security and looking for risk. So the 837 is risk management. The 830, the 839 there is our general information security risk itself. And then finally, I'll also add another one here is COBIT. COBIT is another program recognized as well in the industry. And this is kind of, if you think of COBIT, think of Azaka. This is an Azaka framework that's been developed. And this is basically the business framework for governance and management of enterprise IT. So it's more of a generalized framework for business frameworks dealing with governance and management and obviously risk. So there's different flavors and different versions of these. Again, going back into the business environment, the culture of the business. If you want to go down that ISO path, which is very widely recognized, we can tie in the triple whammy component across risk management, risk assessment, and then information security, which is at 27001. Or if we don't want to spend all that time, well, we can go utilize NIST, right? So NIST has its own framework, risk management framework, along with its actual our component there, which was our 800 TAC 39, which is all about our generalized information security risk as well. So there are many things available to us depending again on the nature and the appetite of the business, and what makes us want to implement these controls better, right? So if we've got buy-in with executives and we define these different parameters and what they are, well then it helps us with implementing these different frameworks and obviously the controls associated with these frameworks as well. I hope you've enjoyed this video. We talked about the different frameworks associated with information security risk. We've gone through our 4 different phases across our risk management lifecycle. As always, thank you for viewing and see you all in the next video. Thank you for watching.